Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started because we've got a lot to get through in an hour. I have to, first of all, apologize. We had applied for CME credits and we have not gotten them. So for any physicians in here that were looking for them, I apologize to you in advance. The other thing, pardon me? Okay. Oh, perfect. And the other apology I have is I'm getting over a cold, and if I have a coughing fit, I might have to ask Julie to come up temporarily and present on my behalf. We'll see how it'll go well. Thank you for coming, everyone. I know it's hard to come out at 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. Just to get a sense of who's here, how many people are working in regulated clinical trials? How many people are working in clinical research but not in clinical trials? Okay. How many people are from PHC? So we're about half-half. So just so you know, for the first about 40 minutes of this presentation, we're going to talk about information that's generic to any research organization. It does focus quite a bit on clinical trials, but we're going to talk a little bit about clinical research as well. And for the about last 15 minutes, we're going to focus primarily on PHC. And then I'm going to hopefully have time for questions. And then once we're done, we have some appetizers and drinks, fortunately not alcohol, but some juice and water if you'd like to stick around and do some networking with your colleagues or if you have additional questions. So I'm going to get going. So our agenda is pretty aggressive. Basically, the focus of this agenda is how regulatory changes are going to affect personnel at sites. So I'm going to talk a lot about the upcoming GCP changes. And really, it's not a change, it's an addendum to GCP. But I didn't want to focus on the sponsor or the REB. This is basically for site personnel and use of a guidance document that Health Canada has released to help site personnel interpret what their interpretation of the regulations are. So it's quite helpful. So that's what we're going to start with. I'm going to do a quick overview of types of clinical research, the Canadian regulations, and some Health Canada changes that have happened in the last few years, just as a quick overview. I'm going to talk a lot about Good Clinical Practice Revision 2. And then I'm going to talk about, as I said, how this affects PHC directly and some of the resources that PHC wants to provide to investigators to ensure that their staff are in compliance with the new regulations. So, of course, everybody always has their own definition in their minds of clinical research. So I wanted to put this up, and I hope you can see it. And this actually comes from the Network of Networks and just talks about what clinical research is versus clinical trials, because there's always a lot of questions about what clinical research is. And clinical trials are part of clinical research, but clinical research is more than clinical trials. And then clinical research that I'm talking about here today includes, sorry, I'm just going to move this, non-interventional clinical research studies, interventional, regulated studies, investigational device clinical trials, and natural health products. So for non-interventional studies, I'm starting really with the studies that are not regulated by the federal government. So non-interventional clinical research studies are not regulated by the federal government in any way. They really have their requirements coming from provincial privacy legislation. So for example, for most of us working in academic research, our privacy legislation is FOIPA. University-based research policies, so these are UBC's policies, 87 and 89. PHC institutional requirements, so each of you have your own institutional requirements you need to meet. And then depending on your project, you might have additional requirements. So if you have Tri-Council funding, there might be extra reporting responsibilities through Tri-Council funding. One of the things they've been talking about for a while, and it hasn't actually happened yet, is they're going to, for all Tri-Council funding, require data management plans. So that's going to be something new, not so much to the clinical research community, but certainly to the social sciences community. And then there's also, I just put in there another example, biobanking requirements. And I didn't want to speak to that because that's not my area of expertise, but I know that there's certainly requirements. So interventional clinical research studies or trials are exactly the same. So you're starting to layer on federal regulations. And if you're doing something that is not a phase 4 study, again, there's really no federal regulations that pertain to your studies. But phase 4, and I really wanted to emphasize this because it's something that gets lost a lot in the regulations. Phase 4 studies actually are regulated by Health Canada. So now I'm going to get into the regulated studies. Health Canada Food and Drug Acts regulates drugs, biologics, natural health products, and medical devices. The International Council, and I think everybody still has that old quiz question in their head, used to be conference, on harmonization. They finalized the Good Clinical Practice Guideline in May of 1996. Health Canada adopted for drugs, biologics, and radiopharmaceuticals in 2001. And it really was the first time to have an international standard for good clinical practice, so studies were acceptable across different countries. The natural health products is very similar if you've ever done a natural health product clinical trial. They do have different regulations, but they're incredibly similar because it's laid on the same framework that Health Canada uses for clinical trials. So drugs, biologics, and radiopharmaceuticals have to be consistent, and this is what Health Canada has adopted here for E6, good clinical practice, general considerations for clinical trials, and data safety management. And so these are international standards that are written into our legislation. And again, I want to keep emphasizing that this is phase 1 to 4 clinical trials. Natural health products, again, as I said, they're very similar. They do they've done the regulations slightly differently, but they do incorporate good clinical practice, federal and provincial laws, and the wording you see here is actually cut and pasted directly from their guidance documents. So again, they're asking for people with suitable expertise in the proper conduct of clinical trials. There doesn't seem to be as many natural health products, or at least we don't see them as much as we used to. And medical devices are kind of a different animal in Canada, for sure. They have been regulated for a long time, since 1998. They are part of the Food and Drugs Act under Part 3, and they're overseen by a group called the Medical Devices Bureau. Health Canada expects manufacturers to follow the Declaration of Helsinki, the Tri-Council Policy Statement, and conform to GCP that's set out in ISO 14155. So they actually have parts of GCP written into ISO, but it doesn't specifically say good clinical practice E6. And trials conducted in Canada that are class 2 to 4, you actually have to apply for authorization through an application for medical device investigational testing. And is there anybody in here that works on device trials? So a few, okay. And there was a new guidance document that was released, and they just ended the comment period on February 16th. So the new guidance document is much better than the guidance we formerly had. I have taken these conference slides from Chad Sheehy, who presented at the 2017 SOCRA annual conference, and he was at the time the director in charge of what was now called RORB. So just in case you're not aware, Health Canada likes to change things around every so often, and they're going through this amazing period of transparency, which for many years they wouldn't phone you back or talk to you. So it's been quite lovely to have them come out and talk to us. But Health Canada is basically divided into the idea that the health products and food branch it receives all the clinical trial applications, and RORB, which is the Regulatory Operations and Regions Branch, does all the inspections. For many years, until 2016, so this came into play in 2002. So from 2002 to 2016, they were doing Health Canada inspections, and the inspectors would be responsible to the region that they were in. They had no responsibility actually to the regulatory branch itself. So it was kind of a bizarre situation that I think could only happen in Canada, but they've changed that now so that all the inspectors have one boss, and that is the person who's in charge of RORB. And recently it changed to a gentleman named Hossein Abid. Unfortunately, Chad moved along, and he was quite lovely to work with. We'd worked with him quite a bit. So that's really the differences. It's an arm's length relationship, but certainly if they're going to do an inspection, they're going to look at the directorates that receive the submissions to see where they should start. They're finally undergoing a compliance review of the program, which is fantastic because I know that who in here has had a Health Canada inspection? Oh, not that many. So they're somewhat painful. I have to say honestly, I've gone through one as a sponsor, an investigator-initiated sponsor. And I think they were quite painful for many years because the inspectors had different interpretations of the regulations, and there was really no one oversight of how they were interpreting the regulations. So that's why they've decided to change that. They are going to start looking at more inspections of different people or organizations. So they are looking at sponsors. They've never gone to sponsors before. To date, all they've ever done is gone to clinical trial sites, and they've only inspected trials that are currently open. So this is changing, and actually they've already gone off-site, out of Canada, to inspect 2 offshore CROs. So a lot of us are now open to inspection that had never been. So the sponsors, they might come right to see us. They might come and see, they've always seen the qualified investigators. CROs, they might come to their office. Site management organizations as well. So it's going to be an interesting change. And this was their plan for the coming year. So they wanted to do international inspections. I know that they've done 2. They're really focused on bioequivalence right now. So I suspect that they're on doing those inspections as we speak. 2 sponsors, and they said it may be open or closed. So it will certainly be interesting for the sponsor if they choose closed studies, and CROs. Oops. So Health Canada is a member of ICH, and they're going to formally adopt R2, so GCP R2, on April 1st, 2018. And in, again, a fashion that I think could only happen in Canada, that we have a guidance document out right now, which is actually, I have to say, for Health Canada, a fantastic guidance document, and I would highly recommend that you have a look at it. This is what it looks like. You can download it. It's open for comment until April 15th. So the regulations come in April 1st, but the guidance document is not going to come into play probably till September, by the time you get all the comments in and they have a look and they incorporate them. So I'm going to depend a lot in this presentation on this guidance document, but I have to say that they put a lot of homework into it and have consulted most of the groups across Canada. So I think it's not going to change dramatically. But as I'm going through these slides, please, if you want to comment, and you'll get a copy of the slides, please go ahead and comment. Have a look at the document and provide your comments, because this is your opportunity. So this draft guide 100, they actually consulted a group that I've been involved with as well. It's called the Initiative to Streamline Clinical Trials. And this was a group that we formed basically through academic organizations to try to help interpret the regulations in a better way, because it's been very difficult, especially for the academic organizations, to deal with inspections and some of the expectations, or unknown, I guess, expectations of the inspectors. Health Canada recognized a need to provide a guidance, which is great, because this is the first time they've really provided one around their thoughts around E6 and how it works. And they really want to use this to fulfill what they see as their interpretation of the regulations. But the nice thing about the guidance document is they also tell you what they're not inspecting, which again is the first time they're telling you exactly what they're not inspecting. So the scope is clinical trials under Division 5. Interested parties are probably everybody in this room, except for the people who are doing straight ahead, just clinical research studies. It covers phase 1 to phase 4, and they talk about phase 1 in this guidance document. And they specifically talk about academic sponsors as well, which is something that they've newly included. It doesn't apply to medical devices, natural health products, and observational studies. But the last meeting I was at with them, they made a hint now whether this is going to happen or not. They were thinking about inspecting medical devices. So that would be something very new for them. And so far, there hasn't been any leaning towards inspecting natural health products. But at least it gives you the interpretation that they're thinking about when they're looking at these good clinical practice guidelines, particularly for natural health products. And phase 4 studies, this is exactly from the document, can be subject to inspection at any time using a risk-based approach. Phase 4 studies, you do not have to apply for a clinical trial application. So this would be something very new and different for Health Canada to branch out and move into inspecting a phase 4 study. In fact, I'm not even 100% sure how they would know about all the phase 4 studies other than going on clinicaltrials.gov, or if they're submitting a lot of serious adverse events. And note that I think it's a good time to have these changes because Health Canada is really trying hard to be transparent, and they've done some changing themselves. So they're trying to adapt, and they're trying to adopt these new regulations.
Will Ariel Cryer please report back to Providence 5 Alpha? Ariel Cryer, please report back to Providence 5 Alpha. Ariel Cryer, please report back to Providence 5 Alpha.
So what's new? Really, it's the same document with addendums. So they've only added information. They haven't taken anything away. So they've expanded the introduction. They have 3 new definitions. They have changed some of the requirements for investigators. They've changed quite a few of the sponsor requirements, or added new sponsor requirements, and they've added to the essential documents section, which is the appendices at the end. So here's the specific addenda if you get these slides and you want to hop into it and see them. There they are, all the new addenda, and it's really easy to see in the document because it says addendum in it. So really, in the introduction, they're talking about why they did this. They have done this to deal with the fact that clinical trial complexity has increased. People are using technology more. Risk management is a common practice in most countries, and they're incorporating it in this document, which is actually a really good thing for a lot of us because it actually relieves some of the pressure that we've had to do monitoring. They want to promote efficient approaches and encourage a mutual acceptance. So here's what's new from the glossary. These are the 3 new ones. So certified copy, monitoring plan, and validation of computerized systems. And having gone through an inspection as a sponsor, the validation of computerized systems was probably the most confusing thing I've ever gone through in my life, since the inspector wasn't actually sure either what they needed from us. So hopefully, they will be able to provide exactly what they're looking for validation. The principles of ICH, so as you can see here, you can see the addendum. So they're now just adding in. This for 2.10, the principle applies to all records reference, irrespective of media type, so then electronic documents. And for 2.13, systems and procedures, they're just talking about anything that's specific to human subject protection and reliability of the trial results. So they're trying to make things a little more specific and cover some of the gray areas of GCP. And I'm going to talk a lot, so I'm going to intermix Draft Guide 100 in here because I think really if you have a chance, have a look at it. They give you some really good, finally, interpretation of how they're looking at things. So anything that you see here, I've cut and pasted out of the draft document. But one of the things that they start talking about, and we've always done this, but it's never been explicit. So CAPA, corrective and preventative action plans. This is something that they're expecting at the site level. So they give an example here of it's important to assess deviations. You have to look at a root cause analysis and an impact analysis. And so you would do that through a CAPA plan. Something else that they've done through interpretation is they're really talking a lot about quality management systems. They put a lot of it in the sponsor section of GCP, but Health Canada is expecting a lot of these things to happen at a site level as well. So they really want to ensure that there's some kind of quality management system. They don't make any specifications about what that is. So We're going to have a woman named Jean Smart come in, and I know she's done talks at other organizations. She talks a lot about how to set up a quality management system, how to set up risk-based reporting and requirements. So we're going to have her come into Providence at some point in the near future as well. As I said, you're going to see sites are going to see their sponsors asking for risk-based approach from, and so this is really giving you an idea of what the risk-based approach is. Nobody quite knows at this time how to do this perfectly, so it's interesting if you're working on pharmaceutical studies, you have seen this approach for a few years now, and it's only going to come into academic studies as we kind of interpret this and figure out how to do it. But again, as I said, the risk-based approach, I think, will help a lot of academic studies because a lot of investigators are using primarily old drugs that are being repurposed for a new use. And so the risk in those kind of drugs, unless you're doing it in an incredibly vulnerable population, is very low. So it actually makes it much easier for academic-based researchers to do those kind of studies now. They've actually provided a list of standard operating procedures that they want to see. So this is fantastic. We all kind of knew this and had compared notes, but there it is. That's what they're expecting. And the one thing I think everybody was always caught off guard in inspections, they would come and they'd look at your contract and say, okay, it says in here you're going to retain the documents for 25 years, but where are you going to do it? What's happening with it? There was a lot of lack of detail for us about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that coming up because there's more specific guidance on that. So here's the addendum for the investigators. So the investigator is responsible for supervising any individual or party to whom the investigator delegates trial-related duties and functions conducted at the trial site. The investigator/institution retains the services of any individual or party to perform trial-related duties and functions, and should ensure that this individual or party is qualified to perform those duties and functions, and should implement procedures to ensure the integrity of the trial-related duties and functions performed and any data generated. That's like the longest sentence in the world. And they talk about how the investigator should maintain adequate and accurate source documents and trial documents that include all pertinent observations on each of the site's trial subjects. Source data should be attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, and complete. So LCOA, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that coming up. But there it is in the regulations. Change to source data should be traceable, should not obscure the original entry, and should be explained if necessary, so via an audit trail. So this is now specific right in the investigator level. So this is, I'm going to talk quite a bit about the investigator site level. So anybody who participated in academic or pharmaceutical studies knows that the sponsor delegates medical oversight to the one investigator at the site. Health Canada calls them the qualified investigator. Still, a lot of people refer to them as the PI. That's the old terminology and the American terminology. So they say outright, the sponsor delegates the responsibility of medical care and decisions and day-to-day running of the trial to the site QI. Delegation logs have always been required, but they were never specific. We were never specifically told that we needed them. So now they're telling us that all tasks must remain the responsibility of the QI unless they're documented. And the documentation in the log has to be up to date, so they can easily tell who's doing the work, and also if they use that to tell if they're qualified to do the work that they're doing. And I'm going to talk a lot more about training. And if you need help, and I'm going to talk again about this later, we do have these logs and templates available on our website, so you can pop in and pull off a delegation log if you need one for an academic study. They provided clarification on who should be on the delegation log. Again, this was an area of lots of problems with sites because in many studies you have a department in a hospital where there's endless number of staff working in that department, and do you need them all in a delegation log? This has been a quandary for years. So now they're telling us specifically they do not need all of the people in the department on the log. They need the manager on the log, and that's it. So that will be good. And then they also talk a little bit about standard of care procedures. they have not really brought that in before. So it's nice to see some guidance on standard of care procedures, because anybody working in a hospital environment is dealing usually with standard of care procedures within their studies as well. They need documented evidence of oversight. So as you'll notice, documentation comes in here again and again and again. So the QI is responsible for supervising everybody, but they also have to have evidence that they supervise them. So you need to have written documentation that you're supervising the staff. Although it says alternative verification methods consistent with ICH principles may also be acceptable. So this is not, again, kind of suitably vague. I'm reading this to mean that if you're using EDC and there's an audit trail within your EDC, then that's suitable. The site investigator is responsible for ensuring staff are adequately trained, and there are procedures in place for trial-related duties and functions. So again, procedures are going to depend on, and I'm reading this as standard operating procedures primarily, but it would depend on the kind of trial that you're doing. The site investigator is responsible for ensuring that all the staff and departments that are working on the trial are qualified. So you have to hire people that have sufficient education, training, and licensing for the job that they do. They have to be trained to work in research, and they have to be trained on the protocol. So that's a lot of training, especially if you're hiring somebody brand new that's never worked in research. You need documented proof of training. So that means every person that has the training actually has to sign and date that they've done the training. So there is proof that they've actually done the training in some format, whether it's handwritten or electronic format. And they're asking for it to be as frequently as it needed. So if you have new staff coming in, they have to be trained. Or if there's changes to the protocol, they have to be trained. So as I said, this whole guidance document really focuses on documentation. That's kind of the big takeaway. So this has always been the golden rule in clinical trials, but if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And now they're introducing formally ALCOA. So as I said, that's attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. They started talking in the guidance document about signing and dating documents, and they incorporated within that certified copies, because again, when we had our Health Canada inspection and our inspector asked us for certified copies, we were somewhat mystified as to what that actually meant, because we'd never been told that we needed certified copies. And it's just as simple as signing and dating. So if you photocopy something, sign and date that and say this is from the original. Some brief statement, that's all you need to do. If you're doing a lot of photocopying, you could have a stamp, but just make it as simple as you can for yourself. You just have to certify that it's exactly the same as the original document you've taken it from. So use the easiest process. There is an emphasis on, as I said, documentation and record retention. So they've actually added a lot more information about the kind of documentation that's needed. So the essential documents, and the essential documents is that appendix that's always been in GCP, and they have to be retained, and that's something that's always happened. This is something I found very interesting. The site investigator requires a written agreement with the hospital to ensure that charts are retained for 25 years, because clinical trial regulations state that you have to keep documents for 25 years. So it says exactly in that. For example, QIs conducting clinical trials within a hospital or medical clinic should secure a written agreement with the institution to ensure that the records of the clinical trial subjects are retained according to the federal regulations, as these prevail over provincial and laws and regulations. And as you know, hospitals don't retain documents for 25 years. So this is something really new that they're specifying. You also need to document where these documents, you need to document where the essential documents are going to be stored so that they can easily trace them. And they really have been talking a lot about going to closed studies. So as you know, there's a lot of staff turnover at places. So if everybody leaves, are they going to be able to find the documents? That's a big concern. And one of the things that UBC fortunately has done is they've created, I think everybody's used Iron Mountain for years, and now you can use UBC. UBC has a secure document storage area, and they're quite lovely in the fact that when you list the documents that you're sending to them, the date that they need to retain them from, they'll automatically destroy them after that date. Whereas Iron Mountain will continue to hold them until you tell them to destroy the documents, even though you put the destruction date on. So I think that will be quite helpful. Even if you can just get them to UBC with the right date on them, at least have a record and they will be destroyed at the right time. And if you need information about that, we can send it to you. This is a little bit more about the sponsor side of things, but again, it affects the sites. So there's really an emphasis on informed consent, as there always has been, but talking about training. So people need to be trained on the standard operating procedure for doing consent. Make sure that when you train on that procedure that you're actually doing what it says. I've heard of a lot of people being cited for having a standard operating procedure that they don't follow. So it's almost worse to have a procedure that you don't follow rather than having nothing at all. So really spend time thinking about how you do it and document it. It doesn't have to be anything super in-depth, but make sure that you have that in place. And for the first time, I think this is probably a relief to everybody, there's guidance on fasting before signing the consent form. This is something that's been, everybody does, and there's never been any kind of guidance on what to do. So they actually say that if it's standard of care at your site, as long as you include it in your standard operating procedure, it's something that can actually be done. So that's a nice change. And there's new guidance on equipment and calibration, because when the inspectors came out and started asking for calibration documents in hospitals, everybody kind of lost their minds, because, of course, why would you have calibration documents for something that's dealt with by biomedical in a hospital? But they've asked for this over the years, and more people have been learning to deal with it. But they also have a few good quotations in here. The focus should be placed on equipment used solely for the purpose of a clinical trial and unrelated to the delivery of standard of care. When you read this draft document, there are a few parts of this calibration and equipment that I find that are not clear, so I'm certainly going to make comments on it. But have a look. And then there's a big reminder in there. So Health Canada for many years targeted investigator-initiated trials. That's who they inspected. They barely went to see pharmaceutical sites because they had a real worry about investigator-initiated trials. So there's a reminder in there that if you're the sponsor of an investigator-initiated trial, you have to adhere to the sponsor requirements and the investigator requirements. So this is more of the PHC stuff now. So help is on the way for you. So really, we've been talking a lot about how to make it easy for everybody in the hospital to adhere to these guidance, this new guidance coming in. And so there already is free education available and standard operating procedures. They've been available for years. These resources that are available fulfill all the Health Canada requirements. They're actually reviewed by a regulatory person who makes sure that they actually adhere to Health Canada requirements and FDA requirements. So they cover everything except for protocol-specific training. There's training. This training is now provided through the BC Support Unit. So for many years, Providence Healthcare Research Institute very kindly paid for the training resources. And now the BC Support Unit is very kindly paying for all the academic groups in the province, which is great. There are some additional resources, and I'm going to talk about those at the very end. So, PCHRI's educational requirements. We've divided it up into categories. So category A, non-interventional studies. So certificates of completion, and this coursework, so you're already doing TCPS2. That's been a requirement since last year. The only addition for this group of people, or these group of investigators, is to have responsible conduct of research for the staff that are doing the study. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in the end how you get this information. You don't have to send in a certificate because it's kept online. So it's through a thing called the CITI program, and when you finish it, there's a record there, and the administrator of PCHRI can see everybody that's completed the education. Some of the things that have been missing in non-interventional clinical research that have been added are some standard operating procedures, because again, this is something that is coming more and more into play. So some very basic ones: team role and responsibilities, team training, informed consent, the process, and a data management plan if it's required. And some additional SOPs may be requested by PCHRI, so a database setup if there's a database required. So interventional clinical research studies. So these are any kind of trial, including phase 4. So the only addition here again is good clinical practice, and that's an online course that you can do. And then there's a list there of the SOPs that will be required. So again, as you can probably see, there's different things added on to each level of complexity with the trials. So the only real changes here again are adding management of investigational products, serious adverse drug reactions, study files, and again, data management plans if required. So category C, anybody who's been doing interventional drug, biologic, radiopharmaceutical trials, this stuff, if you've been doing pharmaceutical studies, you have this already. Been doing this for many years. Responsible conduct of research is new in there because we have a lot of different people that cycle through that don't necessarily have training in research or a background in the ethics behind research. GCP, Transportation of Dangerous Goods, and Division 5. And Health Canada in the guidance document specifically references this kind of training, particularly Division 5 if you're doing clinical trials. They want the staff to be trained in it. And again, just adding on some more SOPs. And of course, if you're doing investigator-initiated studies, there's extra SOPs there, so they're all there if you need to use them. Investigational device studies. So TCPS2 and responsible conduct of research, more SOPs, and the one that's really different in here is the investigational testing authorization for medical devices. But everything else is exactly the same because they're pretty standard across any kind of research study. And natural health products, as good clinical practice as well, is required. And then very similar SOPs to clinical trials. So how to access these SOPs and online training. How many people are using the SOPs right now? Oh, not many. Okay, good. Yeah, we have access to like a full set, so please use them. Don't reinvent the wheel. They're there for you. Contact Julie. She can give you the password and access. They're just on the PCHRI website. The online training is available by something called the CITY program. I've been involved with the groups that has developed all of these training resources. It's called the Network of Networks. And we got together about 10 years, 15 years ago now and thought this is crazy as academic groups that we're reinventing the wheel every time for training. And we were really lucky that we found the CITY program, which was based out of the University of Miami. And it was quickly thrown together because OHRP in the US suddenly changed their needs and needed online training. So that's what they have been specializing in the US and many more training programs. And so they were very happy to take us on as Canadians. So Canadians are the biggest second user outside of the US of this program. When you go in, you can register. So as you can see there, register. And you just have to select PCHRI as your institution. So this is what it looks like. It'll ask you who you want to pick. There's tons and tons of institutions. And so if you've done this training like many people have through other institutions, you can retrieve it that way as well. But if you are doing this new for the first time, please affiliate yourself with Providence Healthcare. And here's the list of courses that we have access to. The Responsible Conduct of Research course comes from UBC. It was actually developed by UBC. And they have a life sciences one and a social sciences. They're actually changing it to develop it into one course. So it's one course that walks you through why research is the way it is and why it's regulated the way it is and really how it should be done. And again, I know some groups are doing the transportation of dangerous goods and paying for it. It's available online here. It depends on what level of shipping that you're doing. You may have to pay for a course, but that's something we can talk to you about. UBC offers courses in transportation of dangerous goods as well. So the requirements will be required from PCHRI, and there'll be notification when they'll be required. And also, just a reminder that when you're doing your institutional approvals or getting your institutional approvals, those departments that are approving the project for you, they can also review the site qualifications to make sure that the staff have what are required. So they may ask about phlebotomy, for example, to make sure that it's people are appropriately trained. So I think this is becoming more and more, everybody's becoming more aware of the training requirements. And then PCHRI wants to make sure that they support the research community here. So they're going to start doing some random educational quality and compliance reviews. And these are really something that are going to be friendly, cooperative, and will provide written feedback. We work really closely at CHAOS with PCHRI, and we have trained monitors who are Providence Healthcare employees. So that seemed to be the best way to do these kind of reviews. I've done them personally for Fraser Health. I did them for many years for Fraser Health, and they're a lot of fun to do. I know everybody gets stressed out when somebody comes in to look at what's going on at your site, but they're not meant to be stressful. They're meant to be helpful, to give you tips, provide you maybe with some systems that you don't have in place, and just make things easier for you. We have tools and templates, as I said. That's on our website, and there's the link that you can click on. There's lots of different tools and templates in there. If you have something that you think is super fantastic and you'd like it on there and you want to share, please let us know. If you find things are missing that you'd like to see on there, please let us know as well. And we also do a Clinical Research 101 series, so that's available for you to have a look at. And then some additional free resources that are available. So ACRP provides online courses. So this was done many years ago through PCHRI, and there's a really large list of courses that you can do through ACRP. Again, they're available online. I don't know how publicly available this notification has been about these resources. So if you need American GCP training, you can do it here. Again, free of charge. So I put Eric's email address in there. You can contact Eric and he'll set you up. As I said, Clinical Trials BC is offering free courses on quality management systems, good documentation practice, and I know that soon they're going to have equipment and calibration and risk management. So we would like to invite them in to come and do some of these courses for us, and if you are free to come, please do, because good documentation practice particularly really goes a long way with Health Canada inspectors. We had done it for our clinicians at our sites, and they thought it was a great idea, so I know that it's something that they want to see. It's Jean Smart that conducts these courses, and as I said, she's going to be invited to come at some point in the year as soon as we can get her in, and if you're interested, please register for the courses. So that's it. I made it through without coughing. Yay! So questions or comments? There's a lot of new stuff in there, or a lot of clarification of old stuff, really. Anyone? Oh, you're a quiet group. Contemporaneous means that if something is done, you should sign it in a timely fashion. So sometimes they'll see an investigator look at a lab value and it's 2 weeks. They sign it. They look at it right away, but they sign it 2 weeks after the fact, and they sign and date it. That's something that they don't want to see. So it has to be within a time limit that works in that trial. Yeah. American GCP is not necessarily written into their legislation. So it's a requirement in trials that you're running in the US, but it's not. The FDA interprets things differently, and they have their own regulations. And Canada, they really decided to adopt the ICH documents that I mentioned before into our regulations. So we really adhere much more closely to GCP. So that's really the only difference. And then another question.
So there was some debate a while ago that because of an audit, it happened actually here at PHC, there was going to be a change in the consenting process. So we're consenting as a PI or a QI, as we're now called up on the screen. We're all supposed to be arm's length because of potential bias and an unmanageable conflict.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of discussion by some here that consenting process was going to change, where in a variable number of steps through the consenting process, the PI was going to be mandated to be involved. Is that actually moving forward?
Great question. It's still looked at on a case-by-case basis. We definitely have parents that we've seen the event to make the very initial contact with the potential participant. But once that person has expressed interest in this, has agreed to participate in the study, it's still reasonable and so there's not that
This is assuming they're making treatment decisions. This is assuming the PI is also making treatment decisions.
yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting from my specific perspective, because we hear that came out of the Health Canada audit. So, it'd be interesting to know from an institutional perspective whether or not that framework is going to be applied as it should be to all or none of the consenting processes, right? I think that because right now the process that exists would allow somebody, an appropriate person to do the consent, and then me as the PI would be available offline for questions and clarifications and things to that extent. So I have a hard time seeing how we could piecemeal in a PI in and out of a particular consenting process. And it seems like we're going to be going down a slippery slope of potential unmanageable bias, right?
Well, the situation we just described is that where the PI is available.
So we're not going to be inserted into this process. Because that's what was described to me, right? It seemed a little bit hard to manage, right? It was described to me that the PI was going to be actively involved in the act of consent. So with various steps, so in and out of the consent process. That's the way it was perceived by some groups here at PhD. So, and I had a hard time with that because I don't know how you manage the bias and the potential for some fun.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure the audit
Oh, totally, yeah. Because it would affect all of us potentially, right? I mean, if that was something which was going to get applied to. So. Okay, thanks very much.
Anybody else? I have to say that, as I said before, I'm really quite pleased with Health Canada to give us interpretation finally after, 15, 16 years of not exactly knowing what they wanted. So it's quite lovely to have that. It's certainly helpful. Again, what you've just mentioned now with consenting, it's different at every center. So I actually do feel sorry for the inspectors when they go in, because not only are they inspecting to the federal regulations, but then they've got to deal with the institutional requirements and provincial requirements and sponsor requirements. But for anybody that's working in regulated clinical trials, it's really in your best interest to understand what the Canadian regulations are, because there's a lot of cases where you'll get a new sponsor coming in from the US or Europe, and they ask you to do specific things, and actually you don't need to in Canada. They don't understand what the Canadian laws are and regulations. So why do extra work, or why sign up for extra regulations when you don't have to? So it really makes it easier if you know the Canadian regulations and you can push back. It's not always easy to push back with sponsors. I know that they're pretty set on their ways, but if you have a good argument, you can argue your way out. If you ever need a presentation about devices, I've got a couple really good presentations about devices. If you need a presentation about signing 1572s and why you do not need to do it in Canada, I can provide you with that. If you're running up against something that seems confusing, because often in clinical trials and clinical research, there's a lot of gray areas, and you're being told to do things and you're not 100% sure if you need to. Certainly reach out to us or the Research Institute or colleagues you have, because somebody's always done it before. It's a small research community in Canada, and we can help you as much as possible. If you get a Health Canada, you get notified you're getting a Health Canada inspection, there's resources available to help you prepare for it. through the network of networks. We have a quality committee that has a whole slide deck and you name it that can help you and get prepared for a Health Canada inspection. So that's available. And then really, if you have questions, you can always contact any of us. But I also wanted to mention that if you do need CE credits for this presentation, please don't forget to sign up on the sign-up sheet so we can email it out to you, and then we'll make it available to you. And other than that, feel free to stay now and have some appetizers and juice and water if you'd like, and meet with your other colleagues. And thanks very much for coming.